All right, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all had a good weekend. All right, I'm optimistic that we're going to finish this chapter today, which means we can move on to chapter 9 on Wednesday. We might have to cover like a last couple of details on Wednesday for this chapter, but we should be able to wrap it up mostly today. And then the other thing that I made a decision about was your next exam, which is due this Saturday. Originally, it was going to include chapter 9, but I'm going to push that onto the third exam. So this next exam is only through chapter 8, which is today's material. That way I don't have to push that exam back any further. And because at that point, then it'd be pushing the second exam really close to the third one, and I want to have some space between them. So I went ahead and made that change, and I will update the syllabus to reflect that. And also I'll get that exam posted probably later today or sometime tomorrow. All right, so be on the lookout for that and keep that in your mind. All right, so last time we left off, we had just finished talking about the hospital's organization, and there we go. So that's where we left off last time. So just thinking about sort of the structural organization of a hospital in terms of like managers and VPs and all the different wings and how, probably the main takeaway is the fact that there's kind of actually two organizations within a hospital. The sort of staff, the managerial staff, and that includes the nurses, and then the medical staff, which is the admitting doctors, right? And the fact that these admitting doctors, despite having a very loose connection to the hospital, actually are the ones in charge of directing all of its resources through admitting patients, right? So that was kind of some of the main takeaways discussing the organizational issues. But now we're going to move on to this issue of who is the residual claimant, right? So despite being not for profit, these hospitals often have revenues that exceeds costs, which we would normally define as profit, right? So who gets these profits, right? That's the question. And there's several possible answers, right? It could be the doctors, the physicians, the admitting physicians that somehow claim the residual. It could be the hospital administrators and or board members. It could be nurses and other employees. It could even be the patients, right? These are all possibilities. And the most likely scenario is that everybody has a finger in the pie, so to speak, right? So it's most likely that to some degree, all of these people are somehow capturing the excess revenue or profit, right? So this is kind of interesting. This isn't, this isn't typical for a standard firm, right? So this is something that's a bit unusual that we haven't seen before in our principles or intermediate micro when thinking about the theory of the firm, right? In those courses, we really just focus on for-profit firms. So this is a bit different, right? But this is how most hospitals operates, right? So in the first case, there's this sort of doctors win it all model, which was developed by Pauly Reedish. So this is the Pauly Reedish model. And in this model, doctors, since they are in control of hospital resources, they direct those resources in a way that enriches their own firms, their own businesses. Okay. Um, and it kind of brings up a question, a relevant question, and that's why don't doctors just own the hospital directly, right? And in fact, that used to be the case several decades ago. Doctors did own the majority of hospitals in the past. And one answer to that question is, well, not-for-profit businesses benefit from the tax code, right? They don't have to pay the same kinds of income taxes as normal for-profit businesses. So if doctors own the hospital directly, then they would be subject to those taxes and they wouldn't get to receive those tax benefits. And on top of that, not-for-profit hospitals are allowed to accept donations. So that's also something else going on there. So that has changed over time. Now it's not the case that doctors own a majority of hospitals. So in other words, we've moved from a for-profit hospital model several decades ago, where a majority of doctors owned hospitals, to this more not-for-profit model. So what's some evidence here regarding doctors being the residual claimants? Well, Sloan and Vrasiu estimate that for-profit hospitals paid about $15 per bed day in income taxes, and if you adjusted that to 2012 dollars, it'd be about $50 in 2012. Okay, so it's a pretty high income tax per bed day. And on top of that, payments received from Medicare and Medicaid services are higher for not-for-profits. So for-profit hospitals don't get as much reimbursement from these programs as not-for-profits do. So that's kind of one issue here regarding why doctors don't just own the hospital themselves. They want to benefit from the tax benefits as well as the Medicare and Medicaid benefits from operating a not-for-profit, as opposed to a for-profit hospital. Another issue with this model is that it sort of treats the hospital staff as homogenous, right? It's completely consistent throughout. There's no subtlety or difference in the way that you can organize the remaining hospital staff, like nurses and administrators and that sort of thing, right? So in that sense, it basically assumes that doctors simply divide profits in a way that's in proportion to the amount of their own work, rather than thinking about sort of the other types of inputs that can take place in terms of nurses and other positions within the hospital. There's another issue that's kind of related to this homogeneity issue, right? It's the fact that within a hospital, there's many different types of specialists, right? Not all doctors are the same, and because these specialists exist, they can enhance their profitability in different ways, right? Simply because there's different types of doctors. And unfortunately, this model has no way of incorporating these issues. So that's really the main drawback here. Um, Profits can only be captured by doctors if the hospital decides to spend its profits in very particular ways. Of course, if the doctor is able to direct most of the resources of the hospital, then they might have the ability to do this. But that's kind of an important question, is whether or not they can actually achieve this. And in fact, there's sort of another issue underlying this, and that's the fact that in a battle over these resources, um, maybe between different specialties or different departments, the profits that they're arguing over might actually end up disappearing in the process of trying to direct these resources one way or another. So they ultimately may go to waste, right? Okay, well, what about the administration or the board of trustees? How might they act or become residual claimants? And the way that we approach this is through what we call an organizational utility function. So a very interesting way to approach a business, because usually utility maximization is an issue for uh, consumers, right? Thinking about consumer choice. It's not typically an approach we use in thinking about firms. So a novel sort of approach here. So the way that we're thinking about this is that hospital administrators and or the board of trustee members are directing resources in a way that maximize their utility, right? And in that sense, they're extracting profit that way. So the original model, the prototype model, came from Newhouse in 1970, and it basically described a decision maker as gaining utility from making decisions over quantity and quality of output. So that's kind of the things that enter the utility function for the administrator. They're choosing a combination of quality and quantity that maximizes their own utility. And another major difference here is that instead of a budget constraint, like in consumer choice, the hospital isn't facing a budget constraint so much. Rather, they're facing a market constraint in terms of the demand that they face. So that's kind of one constraint: is how much demand does the hospital have, as well as a production constraint, right? So you can think of the production function acting as a constraint in this case. And then what the administrator does is they trade off quality and quantity in a way to maximize their utility. So a good question then is, well, where does this utility function come from? Like, you're talking about a hospital or a hospital administrator having a utility function. Where is this originating from? And we basically have to sort of accept this interesting assumption that there's a central decision maker with a stable utility function. Um, so that's a pretty strong assumption, but it turns out that actually might be a relatively safe assumption to make, and we'll see why. And this model is really useful. It helps illuminate the types of decisions a not-for-profit hospital has to make, and we're actually going to revisit this issue a little bit later in the chapter towards the end. So we'll come back to this issue, but um, yeah. So later on, we'll take a look specifically at this utility function issue. But for now, let's move on to thinking about either employees or patients acting as the residual claimants. And the way that this happens is it's either in terms of higher wages for employees. That's how they would capture the profit, or lower prices for patients. That's how patients might capture the profit. Right. So profits are returned to employees in the form of higher wages, or returned to patients in the form of lower prices. So when thinking about this, we can think of this as maybe what is desired by policymakers, right? When policymakers are thinking about the types of businesses that we should consider not for profit, they're usually thinking of it in terms of benefiting either the employees or the customers of the business, or perhaps both, right? And that's what the not for profit is doing, is it's helping out the employees and or the customers, which is fairly common. If y'all have ever shopped at like a co-op, co-ops are not for profit, and the whole operation is intended to provide lower prices to customers, people that are part of the co-op. So the profit is redistributed to the customers in the form of lower prices. So that's exactly what a co-op does. So that's kind of the idea, at least from a policy standpoint, in terms of the argument for why have a not-for-profit. Well, it's typically to benefit either the employees or the customers or both. Now, there is one issue that this model faces, and that's it's basically silent on the choice of quality. Although, if we can tie this model to the administrator utility maximization model that we just talked about, then it can materialize and be tied into that type of model in terms of lower prices. and that increase in quantity, right, which is one of the goals of the utility maximizing administrator is or quantity, right? That's one of the goals of the administrators to increase quantity, and so lower prices for the customer would mean higher quantity, which would at least partially achieve their goal, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. And in fact, probably the best model would be a utility maximizing model that not only includes quantity and quality, but perhaps a few of these other things like physician wage, employee wage, and lower price for the customer. Right? And that's actually what we're going to talk about a little later. Now, what's the other option in terms of organizing a hospital? Well, that's for-profit, right? Rather than not for-profit, you could have a for-profit hospital, and they do exist. And in that case, it looks more like a standard business, right? There are shareholders or owners of the business, and they are the residual claimants. But because not-for-profit hospitals exist in the same spaces, these for-profit hospitals have to compete for patients with these not-for-profit hospitals. Now, despite the difference in terms of profit taking, these two different types of hospitals actually end up looking very similar in terms of their structure, organization, equipment, and in management styles. But there are some slight differences in terms of cost and outcomes. So you can see box 8.1 for the evidence on the performance of for-profit versus not-for-profit hospitals. So I encourage you to take a look at that. It's a pretty small little box, so it shouldn't take you long to take a look at that. But there you can see the differences. And some of the main differences are in terms of, let me just go ahead and talk about a few of them so that when you look at it yourself, you're a little bit familiar. So for-profit hospitals had a slightly higher cost of admission and a slightly higher cost per patient day, although the differences were not statistically significant. So they were basically, from a statistical standpoint, there was no difference between them. Although the data did show significant differences in the cost of drugs and supplies. For-profit hospitals used more drugs and supplies, so they had a higher cost for those things. And in addition to that, for-profit hospitals had a higher markup, so they were charging a higher markup over their costs, which kind of makes intuitive sense, right? So yeah, I encourage you to take a look at that and take a look at some of the differences there on your own. Okay, so let's now get back to this utility maximization problem, right? So this is actually a model that comes from political science. So this is a political theory, which is pretty interesting, a nice blend of the two sciences, economics and political science. So this model that we're going to learn is actually a very, very simplified version that's used to understand legislative behavior. So in this model, we're focusing again on the administrators, but really the board of trustees, which can be different and usually are different. But this model focuses on the board. And so the board members each have a utility function. That's the assumption. They each have a utility function, and the utility that they obtain depends on the number of patients they serve, which we call N, as well as the quality of care that they provide, which we call S for quality of service. Okay, so that's the utility function. And to make this as simple as possible, we're going to assume that there's only 3 trustees and that they resolve issues by majority rule voting, right? So they vote on an issue and majority rule. There's majority rule. And it's probably easiest to understand this simply by looking at a graph. Okay, so we have 3 different trustees, A, B, and C. And the curve B to B, that's basically, in a sense, kind of like a budget constraint. But it's really more, you can think of it more like a production possibilities frontier. So it's really a production constraint, right? So this is basically just a PPF. And then we have indifference curves for each of the different trustees, right? So UA, we see several different indifference curves, one of which is tangent to the PPF. We see another one for trustee B, which is tangent, and then another one that's for trustee C that's tangent. So each of these different trustees has different preferences over quality of service, which is on the y-axis, and quantity, right? The number of patients served on the x-axis. So just to describe these preferences a little bit, trustee A has a higher preference for quality over quantity. C has a higher preference for quantity over quality, and then B is kind of in the middle, right? B has likes a middle ground. So these are the different preferences, right? So they're going to each propose a policy that aligns with their own preferences, right? So trustee A is going to come in and say, we really need to improve our quality and not worry so much about treating a lot of patients. That's their policy preference. Trustee C is going to say the opposite. No, we need to not focus as much on quality and focus more on treating more patients, right? That's going to be trustee C's policy position. And then B, of course, is somewhere in the middle. So what's going to happen when they go to vote on these policies, right? And basically, it's a result from political science. It's called the median voter, right? The median voter outcome. So whoever is the median voter in a majority rule voting setup will basically be able to get what they want. So in this case, trustee B can propose the policy that they want and can convince at least one of the others to join them, right? Because if you think about A for a second, right, trustee A is going to prefer B's policy compared to C's, right? C is the least preferable to trustee A. And so A would rather go with B than with C. And it's the same for C. C would rather vote on B's proposal than on A's proposal. And so what ends up happening is one or both of these members agree with trustee B, and that ends up being the policy of the hospital. And so what effectively happens is that the hospital's utility function is trustee B's utility function, right? So that's what happens in this model, right? So this is a great model, right? It uses things that we're already familiar with, and the logic behind the median voter outcome is fairly straightforward, right? The intuition is fairly straightforward. So this is a great model, right? That seems pretty simple and nice. So, right. So I kind of just went over these points here. Actually, each trustee knows how to achieve their own maximum possible utility and proposes their preferred combination of quality and quantity. And like I said in the previous example, trustee B will win because their combination of quality and quantity gives a higher utility to trustee A than C's preferred set, and similarly for C. And so basically what happens is that B can form a coalition with either A or C and doesn't need to compromise, right? They don't need to negotiate at all. They can stay firm with their own preferences and end up winning. Right. And so that, like I said, this is known as the median voter outcome. And it's true of basically all majority rule voting systems. Okay, so therefore B's utility function becomes the hospital's utility function. So one issue that I touched on a second ago is this issue of stability, right? Are the preferences of the hospital stable, or are they changing over time? So to think about this, we really need to think about the composition of the board, right? And so these board members basically have limited terms, whether it's limited by statute or limited by their lifespan. In any case, it's going to be limited and will eventually come to an end. And so new members have to be selected. Well, the board selects the new members. And what ends up happening is that members end up replacing themselves with someone very similar uh, in their preferences. And if this happens, then the board will more or less remain stable, and therefore the preferences of the hospital will more or less remain stable. And these outcomes can are basically remain the same as the board grows in size. So it doesn't matter if the board is 3 people or 99 people, right? The median voter gets what they want, and everybody has to bend to their will. And this outcome even is true under different types of voting rules. Um, so even if it's not necessarily majority rule, it could be, maybe 2/3 majority, right? Similar outcomes still occur, which is nice, right? Even as the model becomes more complex, the results more or less stay the same. So that's nice. Okay, so the really nice thing about this model is that it can actually accommodate all of the previously discussed models, right? The doctor as residual claimant, patients as residual claimant, employees as residual claimant. This model can handle all of those possibilities, and all we have to do is expand the utility function to include not just quantity and quality, but also to include things like physician income, employee income, et cetera, right? So if we include those as objectives of the utility function, then we can actually incorporate all of these models in one unified model. Although this does bring up one more issue, and that's who best has the ability to convince board members that their concerns are most important, right? And um, it's most likely that physicians are going to be most easily able to get board members on their side, right? It's going to be harder for patients, especially, as well as perhaps other employees like nurses and middle managers. Okay, so what does this all mean in terms of what we can observe? Well, it means, for one, that we should expect to see different types of not for profit hospitals, and each type is going to depend or reflect the preferences of their board members, right? So um, you might have a Catholic hospital, right, like St. Mary's, typically whose board members are clergy members, priests and that sort of thing. So obviously, a Catholic hospital is going to look a lot different than a different not-for-profit hospital that's not religiously affiliated, simply because it consists of different board members that have different types of preferences, right? So we should see a dispersion of types of not-for-profit hospitals. So that's kind of one prediction coming from this model. So one other thing that's important in this utility maximization model is the fact that not-for-profits can accept donations. And so there's actually another set of sort of interested parties that can maybe influence the decisions of the hospital, and that's the donors. Especially when you think about the ways that people typically donate to hospitals. So typically donors are giving money to a specific cause or function of a hospital. And it typically corresponds with their own personal health experiences, right? So people that have lost family members to cancer will give money to cancer centers and that sort of thing. So donors have special interests, right? They're not just giving money blindly, in other words. And so this represents another set of people that could potentially influence the way that the hospital goes in terms of its direction. Um, right, and you can actually take a look. We're going to take a look at Figure 8.5 to illustrate how a targeted donation could alter the behavior of the hospital. So using the model we just learned, incorporating donations here. Okay, so we're focusing only on the utility of trustee B. So we're ignoring the other two because in the end, trustee B is the median voter, so they get what they want. So we can kind of ignore the other two. And what we're looking at here is the original production possibilities frontier, the original production constraint. And then the idea is that the donor comes along and says, hey, I will give you this huge chunk of money, which will allow you to expand your production possibilities, but I'm only going to give it to you if you treat a minimum number of patients, N star. Okay, so we kind of get an interesting PPF that's kind of like just a segment of a PPF, right? Because in order to get those extra resources, the hospital has to treat N star patients or more. And so there's going to be a condition, there's going to be a set of conditions, I guess, under which the trustee is willing to accept the donation or not, right? And so in this case, what we see is a scenario where the trustee would accept the donation because it allows them to increase their utility from U1 to U2. Okay. So that's how we can actually, that's a way that we can apply this model, which is pretty cool. Now, of course, there would be scenarios where the trustee would not be willing to accept the donation because it wouldn't allow them to increase their utility. In which case, there might be some negotiation about the donation, right? Either the donation needs to be bigger in order for us to accept these restrictions on the number of patients, or we need to relax the restrictions, right? So that's kind of the result of that there, right? So like I said, the donor specifies a minimum quantity in order for the hospital to receive the donation. And in the case that we saw, the trustee B prefers the expanded budget in exchange for the restriction. The other thing to note was that there was a slight reduction in quality, although that's not obvious here. It looks like there's actually a slight improvement in quality the way it's drawn, but it could be that the donation, because of the number requirement, actually does reduce quality, but the administrator or the trustee might still be willing to accept that trade-off if the donation is big enough, right? And just for the heck of it, let's also think about trustees A and C. Well, remember that C prefers more patients anyway, so they're totally for it, right? They're like, yeah, more patients, yeah, let's take the money. I want more patients anyway. And then at that point, basically, trustee A's choice becomes irrelevant because B prefers it, C also prefers it simply because there's more patients now, and since they are since they have a coalition, they win the majority. And like I said, if the gift is too small, then the trustees might try to negotiate to either get an increase in the donation or relax the restriction in such a way that they're at least as well off as they were before, if not better off, right? All right, there's one other thing that this model can handle, and that's changes in laws and regulation. Okay, so any changes in the laws or regulation of a hospital will inherently alter their production possibilities, right? So it'll change the PPF and therefore change the apparent utility function of the hospital. So if we imagine that there's a stable legal system where laws and regulations aren't changing, then changes that occur from hospital to hospital are going to be more sporadic and less systematic, right? So something like the change in the board member composition or perhaps other power dynamics could lead to behavioral changes at the hospital, but they're going to be less systematic than these other ones that we've discussed and more sporadic. But it seems safe to assume that hospitals behave according to a single decision maker's stable utility function. The only things we have to assume is that there's a relatively stable legal system and that something like the median voter outcome happens. If we have that, and the dynamics, the changing in the board composition stays relatively stable. If all these things are relatively stable, then we can more or less assume that the hospital almost has its own utility function and that it's stable. And if we can do that, then we have a really great model. So that's cool. All right, any questions about that? We're going to move on to hospital costs now if there's no questions. All right. So we can approach hospital costs pretty much in the same way that we approach any firm's costs. And that is to say that hospitals face economies and diseconomies of scale, much like other firms, like normal firms, right? In other words, a U-shaped average cost curve, right? That's the same thing as economies and diseconomies of scale. There have been a lot of studies that tackle this issue, some finding that there are rising costs, while others find falling costs, and yet others find constant costs, which seems to imply that, yeah, there's a U-shaped curve. It's just that these studies, for whatever reason, happens to narrow in on one part of the U-shaped curve, right? So that's not surprising or concerning at all. Now, something to think about is, right, if we're thinking about the scale of the hospital, what's the appropriate way to think about that? And it's typically measured in terms of either the number of patients treated, so kind of like N in the utility function, or it's the number of patient days produced. So that's typically the terms of the scale, right? Now, from a conceptual standpoint, if we're thinking about this, the best possibility for researching this issue is that we have two hospitals that are identical in every single way except for their scale, right? A ceteris paribus type situation, right? All things else equal. But of course, that's not going to be true in reality, right? There's no two hospitals that are identical in every way except for scale. That's just not possible, right? Hospitals are very, very complex organizations that have lots of ways that they can be different from one another, right? So in that case, we need a way to control for these differences in complexity as well as scope potentially. And that turns out to be a very difficult task, statistically speaking, right? So that's pretty difficult, and it's typically because of the limitations in the data that's available. It's not so much an issue of the methodological. It's not so much an issue of the statistical methods. It's more an issue of the data that's available. But an important thing to think about is this scope issue, right? So there's not only scale, right? How many patients is the hospital admitting, or how many patient days is it's producing? But there's also this issue of scope, right? Like, if it has an MRI machine, is it like state of the art, or is it one from 20 years ago, right? In both cases, those hospitals have an MRI department, but obviously the scope is much different, right? So a lot of times there's changes in scope, and sometimes they're easily observable, right? We can see them easily. Oh, this hospital now has a neurosurgery department, right? So not only are they admitting more patients, but they have more abilities, right? They have more specialists, perhaps, or departments, right? So that's kind of the scope. But the scope also can show up in ways that's not observable, right? And that creates an issue for us. It's hard to measure those things that are unobservable, especially. Another issue that's kind of related to scope is the types of patients that a hospital serves. Right, so there are, what are considered community hospitals that provide very routine, basic care to those living nearby. There's a primary care hospital like not far from me. It's relatively small, but it mainly focuses on serving the immediate community, and it doesn't really have like a lot of highly advanced technical ability. It can really only provide some basic primary care functions. And then, of course, there's other hospitals that are, they specialize in very complex care, serving very wide areas, sometimes spanning many states, right? So I don't know, you may have had a friend or a family member who had a very complicated health issue and they had to go to a hospital like in another state because that state's hospital had, a particular team or a particular doctor that knew, about that particular disease or ailment, right? Now, something to keep in mind about these complex specialty hospitals is that they often have patients who are sicker because of the fact that they specialize in these complicated health issues. So keep that in mind. So thinking about all of these factors, right? The fact that there's all these different issues makes an accurate estimation of costs really difficult. Best case scenario, really hard to estimate. An even further complication is this issue of whether a hospital is able to handle unusual events. And the first thing I thought of was the pandemic, right? That was one of the major issues, especially early on, was we just don't have enough beds, right? We're filling up ICUs, we're filling up all these other wings of the hospital with COVID patients. We can't even treat other patients that are, normal. So that's another issue is how much ability does the hospital have to handle unusual events? And this is called standby capacity, right? Sort of, what happens if there's a hurricane or something, some unusual event that would cause a spike in the demand for services, right? And again, sometimes these things are easy to observe, like the number of beds, very easy to observe, while other standby capacity is not easily observed, like maybe a hospital's ability to conduct complicated lab tests, right? That's not easy to measure. So in this case, right, the real issue is that even the same ability can mean different things for different hospitals, and I kind of alluded to this with the MRI, right? It could be that one hospital has a very powerful, brand spanking new MRI machine, and another hospital has older and smaller MRIs, but it has several of them, right? Both of them would be listed as having the ability to conduct MRIs, but obviously there's a difference between their abilities, even though they both have the ability to conduct MRIs, right? So that would be unobservable, right? Um, which is always a complication for statistical analysis. Those unobservables are always the issue, right? All right, so let's look at the evidence on economies of scale. So in one study, they had data and methods that dealt with many of the problems that we've talked about, but unfortunately, they were not able to fully control for the output mix, right? The mix of sorts of outputs, right? Because again, we're trying to measure this in terms of like the number of patients seen or the number of bed days or hospital days, right? Um, and that's kind of an aggregate, right? That's an aggregate of information. So there's loss of information. Um, this hospital in rural Georgia sees 1,000 patients a day, and so does this urban center for cancer. They both see 1,000 patients a day. Can we say that they produce the same? Of course not, right? They didn't produce the same stuff. The output mix is incredibly different, right? So that's really a huge issue here for them. But they were able to provide some evidence. So they found that the marginal costs of inpatient care uh, rose with both patient discharge and patient days produced. So the more, thinking about scale in terms of patients seen or patient days produced, as the scale of those things grew, marginal costs went up. Sorry, they rose. Okay, so that would indicate diseconomies of scale, right? Costs go up as the scale of the hospital increases. And so, just to put some numbers to this, they found that the prices or costs of discharge were 533, 880, and 1084 for low, medium, and high volume hospitals, respectively. Okay, so you see the increase in costs there as the hospitals get bigger in terms of volume, right? The number of patients seen. Okay, so that's suggesting diseconomies of scale. What about in terms of patient days produced? Slightly different result. So they found that the cost increased when going from low volume to medium volume hospitals, and then fell slightly going from medium to large volume hospitals. So that would actually indicate sort of the opposite, right? An upside down U, which is not something that we have in theory. So that's a bit unusual, I suppose. But the authors felt that the differences in the cost of discharge, the one on the previous slide, they felt that those differences were way too big to simply represent efficiency of operation, right? So something else is going on. It's not just about economies of scale. And basically, they concluded that the differences in complexity as well as the quality of care between hospitals is simply too difficult to control for, and that's probably why they have the findings that they have. But they did find one area where there were persistent economies of scale, and that was within emergency departments. So that's interesting. And one kind of question that kind of brings up is, well, if that's true, right? If we consistently see economies of scale, right, declining costs for emergency rooms, why don't we see like really, really, really big emergency rooms? And that's an issue that is kind of still open for debate, an area of research. Now, there's one other issue to think about, and that's kind of a cost that is technically external to the hospital, but we might want to include it because it technically is a cost that's involved in the production of health, and that's the travel costs that patients have to incur. And if we do include the travel costs, then at some point, hospitals will eventually face diseconomies of scale, right? Because eventually you get a distance that's so big, right? If the hospital wants to expand its scale, we're basically talking about it increasing the size of the area that it serves. And as it increases the size of the area, then the distance that patients have to drive is going to get really big, right? So eventually we're going to get increasing costs in terms of travel costs. So that's one thing to think about. And this could be particularly severe in the case of very time-sensitive emergencies like heart attack, right? In that case, the travel cost is really big, right? Even if it's a short distance or a short time, those minutes really matter in those cases, right? Yet another issue, though, is quality, right? Um, as a hospital expands, it's possible that will have changes in the quality of care that it provides, right? And the intuition or the preconceived notion is that larger hospitals will have a better ability to hire more specialists, better trained specialists, and have more and better standby equipment. And so bigger hospitals should be able to provide a better quality of care. So let's see what the evidence has to say on that. Right. So the way to think about this is sort of inverse to costs, right? So just as costs can decline first and then increase, we have something similar with quality. It's that perhaps quality first increases and then maybe decreases, right? So it's kind of inverse to the U-shaped cost curve. And the idea there is that, yeah, it makes sense that as the hospital grows, the quality can improve because it can afford better doctors, more specialists. It can afford better equipment. But at some point, you get so many specialists that the care becomes kind of fragmented, right? And there's so many specialists that each specialist cares a lot about one particular aspect of the patient's condition, but they don't actually care about the whole patient because they're focusing on one particular aspect uh, that regards their specialty, right? So the way to think about that is there's too many cooks in the kitchen in this case, right? So that might be the intuition there for the sort of inverse U shape of quality, right? Increase in quality at first, but then eventually it decreases because you basically get too many cooks in the kitchen. All right, so a discussion of the costs of a firm would not be complete without talking about the difference between long run and short run, right? So this should hopefully be review. Um, and really what's at issue here is how much do costs vary with patient loads, right? If these things move very closely together, right? If costs change and they change in a way that's very closely tied to the change in the number of patients seen, then that suggests that most of the costs are variable, right? Um, you're only going to have more costs if you see more patients, right? The standard definition of variable cost, right? A cost that changes with output, right? If the opposite's true though, and the costs don't change much, right? The costs are more or less fixed when patients increase or decrease, then most of the cost structure is fixed. So hopefully this is ringing some bells for you, right? That's the main difference between the long run and the short run is this matter of fixed costs, right? So the short run is defined as a time period in which at least one input is fixed or one cost is fixed. Whereas the long run is the time period that's long enough for all costs to be variable, right? So hopefully that's review for y'all. So that we're thinking about the same thing here, right? No difference with the hospital. So let's think about the extremes, right? In the shortest of short runs, almost all costs are fixed except for maybe a few supplies like food and medicine, right? The opposite extreme, everything's variable, even the rebuilding of the hospital, right? Which could take years, but in the long run, that's a variable input, that's a variable cost, right? Of course, in the long run, we're all dead. Quote from John Maynard Keynes, the famous macroeconomist. Right. So again, the real issue here is how does a hospital's costs fluctuate with patient load? And the answer is going to depend on whether we're in the short run or the long run, and the corresponding cost structure. Okay, we're doing pretty good on time. We might finish this stuff. We'll see. Got about 20 minutes left. All right. So one study investigating this issue suggests that in the meaningful short run, which they defined as the capital stock doesn't change, so that's their definition of short run. In their short run, about 70% of costs are fixed, so a high fixed proportion of costs. And the main reason for this is that you can think of sort of right. There's wings of a hospital that typically specialize in different aspects of medical care, and each wing has a more or less fixed amount of equipment and staff. So they have a certain number of beds that really doesn't change, and then they have a pretty much fixed staff. So nurses, PAs, nurses assistants, all those components of labor are more or less fixed in that wing, at least in the short run, right? So it doesn't matter if they're at 50% capacity or 90% capacity, they basically have the same amount of equipment and staff on hand at any given moment. Now, of course, there can be long run adjustments, right? So if the hospital is, always sitting at 50% capacity or less, then it might decide to reduce the number of beds it has. And if it has fewer beds, it needs fewer nurses and those sorts of support roles. But that's a more long run adjustment, right? But these issues show up particularly in a lot of policy questions. The importance of fixed versus variable cost shows up in a lot of policy questions. So, and the reason for that is that states that have regulations that are dictating hospital prices, they have a choice to make, right? They have a policy decision to make, and they have to decide how to change the whether typically it's price ceilings, right? A cap on prices. They have to decide how to change that price ceiling given changes in, say, occupancy. Another policy issue is that some regulatory programs make payments to hospitals based on their historical costs. Okay, so this is this brings up a particularly important issue, right? Let's say that patient loads are declining over time, right? So the hospital is seeing less and less patients, and over time, then average costs will rise, particularly if they're on the economies of scale part of the cost curve, right? If they're on the economies of scale part of the cost curve and they begin seeing fewer patients, that means their costs are going back up, right? So if a hospital is experiencing that, their costs are going up, but they're getting payments from the state that are based on history, then those historical prices or those historical costs are going to be lower than they are now because their costs are going up as they see fewer patients. And so they're going to be in a sort of financial squeeze in that case, right? So these are the issues related to cost and policy. But in any case, at the end of the day, we get a very similar picture that we've all seen before, right? Average total cost is U-shaped, average variable cost is U-shaped, average fixed cost is approaching zero. And then the gap between ATC and AVC is just the size of the gap is just average fixed cost, right? So just to point that out a little bit more, right? Over here, where the average fixed cost is really high, the gap between these two is really big, right? That's because the difference between them is the size of the average fixed cost. And then as it approaches zero, these two become closer and closer together, right? This should all be a review. This should look very familiar. So not really any difference other than other than all these issues we've talked about, right? That's a difference. But at the end of the day, despite the issues, the cost structure is going to look basically the same as a typical firm, right? U-shaped ATC and AVC cost curves, and just to remind you, that comes from declining marginal productivity, right? I basically stated that in words right there, but the average total cost curve is just the sum of the other two. And then the important difference between typical firms and hospitals that we're looking at is that for not-for-profit hospitals, the average total cost must equal average revenue, right? They have to equal, or they have to achieve zero profit, right? In other words. And so the figure that we saw is actually drawn to reflect that a lot of the costs that the hospital has are fixed, right? Which is basically this huge upfront fixed cost, right? And then the U shape that is kind of flat at first. So that reflects high proportion of fixed costs for the hospital. Okay, so we've talked a lot about economies of scale and the cost curves, but what about the quality of care and how that relates to size, right? So how does quality change as the scale changes, as well as ownership? If ownership changes, does that change quality as well? So first, let's tackle the size, the scale issue, right? Now we've been dancing around this issue a little bit, but again, as the hospital expands its scale, its scope also expands. So just think about the MRI machines again, right? One hospital has a really nice MRI machine, another one has older MRIs that are smaller and less powerful. That's scope, right? Or specialists. That's probably a better way to think of it, right? Bigger hospitals can have more specialists, so they have a broader scope of treatment. Um, so there should be a systematic relationship between size and quality then, right? If a bigger hospital can have more specialists, then it should also have a higher quality of care. And there are, in fact, several studies that show that there's a strong relationship between experience, right? So the experience of a specialist or a team of specialists and and outcomes, health outcomes. So as a specialist or team of specialists has more experience, they provide better health outcomes for their patients. So the first study to look at this was Luft, Bunker, and Enthoven. They used outcomes for 12 operations in 1,500 hospitals. And they found that hospitals that did 200 or more complex procedures, such as the cabbage that we learned about a long time ago, or open heart surgery, these types of procedures, they have lower mortality rates, 25 to 40% lower than their lower volume equivalents. They found some procedures like hip replacement surgery that basically had a flattening of the mortality curve around 100 procedures, so not quite as much experience is needed in things like hip surgery to reduce mortality. And then there were some other procedures that there was apparently no difference in mortality. But the more complicated procedures is where the gains were. So it seems like experience causes better outcomes, right? Or higher quality, in other words. In a slightly later study, but more recent to us, Hughes, Hunt, and Luft looked at the outcomes of 500,000 patients from almost 800 hospitals. And these patients all received one of 10 specific surgical procedures. They found basically the same results, but they also found something previously undiscovered. They found this low volume doctor effect. So what they found was that these low volume doctors who performed a large proportion of a hospital's surgery were more likely to create poorer outcomes. So what does this mean? It basically means rural doctors, right? Low volume, so they don't see a lot of people, and they're working in a small hospital that doesn't have a lot of doctors, so they perform most of the hospital's surgeries. And in these cases, those doctors were more likely to create poorer outcomes for their patients. So that was an interesting finding. But it kind of clouded this debate, right? It seems that there are, it's pretty hazy what the doctor specific effects are. And that's a result of this low volume doctor effect that they found. But at the very least, they are finding consistent hospital specific effects. And really what's at issue is this referral effect versus practice makes perfect effect. So let's see, I feel like I skipped a slide. So what's really at issue is the causal relationship, right? So what we're seeing is that it looks like more experienced doctors provide better care, right? But there's an issue here. We can't necessarily determine that better doctors caused better outcomes. Okay? It could be that the larger hospitals can provide better outcomes and can hire more specialists. So the causality is kind of in the other direction. And that's referred to the referral effect, right? These hospitals are getting more patients because of referrals. And it's not that the doctors are better and creating better outcomes. It's kind of the inverse, right? So the question really is, which direction does the causality go? Is it the referral effect or is it the practice makes perfect effect? So it's not exactly clear. In an even more recent study looking at Medicare data, McClellan and Stager looked at a risk-adjusted 90-day mortality rate for those that had a major heart attack. And they found that higher levels of annual admissions of Medicare patients with acute myocardial infarction, which is basically heart attack, um, they had improved mortality measures. So similar results as before, more experience, better outcomes, right? That's basically the same result. And in terms of magnitude, they found that each 100 additional admissions reduced mortality by about 1 to 1.5 percentage points. And so even though we can't determine the causal relationship, it's more or less just a correspondence or a correlation. At the very least, we can determine that the quality of care differs very importantly between large and small hospitals for these types of patients, these heart attack patients. But it's not clear if this extends to others. So there's kind of an opportunity for some research here to see if this type of relationship extends to, people with lung issues or knee and hip issues or other types of problems, right? All right, so forgive me if I go a little fast here. I just really want to finish this chapter. um, So one other thing that was nice about their study is that they were able to estimate the differential effects of hospital ownership. So this is kind of something we haven't touched on yet. So does who owns the hospital matter in terms of quality? So they found that government-run hospitals had AMI mortality rates of about 1 to 1.8% higher than not-for-profit hospitals. So government hospitals did a little bit worse than not-for-profit hospitals. And for-profit hospitals were kind of in between government and not-for-profit hospitals. And they also found one other thing. They found that hospitals that had a teaching status, so they have not interns, residents, right? Hospitals that have residents had a slight improvement in AMI mortality. So that's pretty interesting. And that kind of makes sense too, right? If you're a teaching hospital, um, you're probably going to be a little bit more careful about your care because you're teaching it to other people, right? So I think that's intuitive. In a related study to this ownership issue, Hallbrook et al. Studied the learning curve in heart transplant surgery. Now, this actually is related to the experience issue. I'm not sure why this came after the ownership issue. This is the experience issue. So what they found was that as a transplant team gained experience, the costs fell from 82,000 for the first transplant case to 50,000 for the 10th case, all the way down to 25,000 for the last case in the series, which was a team that had performed 71 operations. All right, one last complication here, the issue of outpatient surgery. So there's an important distinction here, right? There's inpatient surgery and outpatient surgery. Inpatient is when the patient stays in the hospital overnight for at least 1 day, whereas outpatient surgery is when the patient is sent home the same day of surgery, so they don't stay overnight. And there's been some trends over time that are pretty interesting regarding this. So as far as inpatient admission, it more or less remained flat going from 1975 to 2005. But it's not just admissions that matter. It's also how long the patient is staying at the hospital, something known as average length of stay. And over this period, even though admissions stayed flat, the average length of stay declined over this period substantially. And we can actually see this in table 8.1. So you see admissions more or less remaining flat, a little bit of a dip there in the 90s, I guess, but it kind of rebounded. But what really changed was this average length of stay. It went down substantially over this 30-year period, basically cut in half. Okay, so that's what we saw there. We also see here inpatient days. So the number of inpatient days has declined. And that's basically a result of the average length of stay declining, right? Those two are related to each other. And then there's outpatient visits, right? People that go get surgery and leave the hospital the same day. And you can see that the numbers have increased dramatically, right? Almost getting close to having tripled over that 30-year period. And then it's really obvious when you look at outpatient surgery as a percentage of total surgeries. Outpatient surgery was almost not even a thing in 1975, and it has grown to represent over 63% of all surgeries are now outpatient surgeries. And this is mostly driven by technology, right? Where did these patients go, right? Partially into ambulatory care, so outpatient clinics, emergency rooms, things that are not inpatient care. Right, we saw this. Outpatient visits grew from 250,000 to well over 500,000 in the 30-year period. It was a 165% increase. Right, and then the other issue is the proportion of outpatient surgery, almost 63% in more recent times. And again, this is mostly due to technological innovation. So you might have heard things like minimally invasive surgery, right? So a surgical procedure that's minimally invasive so that the patient doesn't have to spend a lot of time recovering. And in fact, it's so minimally invasive, they can go home the same day that they have the surgery. Now, this has kind of created an issue for a lot of hospitals in terms of their revenue stream, right? They get money by keeping people in beds, and all of these people are having surgery and going home, not staying in a bed. So it's kind of caused a revenue issue for a lot of hospital managers. So pretty interesting. Oh man. Okay, so I think we might have to cover the rest of this next time on Wednesday. I mean, I guess I could fly through this, but I don't want to. We have like a good 6 or 7 slides left. So I think we'll leave this until Wednesday. So we'll wrap this up in the first 10 or 15 minutes of class on Wednesday, and then we'll start chapter 9. And then you'll have you have your exam this Saturday. And I think there were maybe a couple of you that joined late, so you missed my announcement. So I'll go ahead and restate it now. Your second exam was supposed to cover through chapter 9. And since we're probably not going to even be able to finish chapter 9 by Wednesday, I decided we're going to cut chapter 9 off of off of exam 2. So exam 2 is only going to cover, let's see, which is it? Let me see here. Go ahead and stop this real quick. So your second exam will cover 5, 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so that's what's going to be covered on your exam that's due Saturday, chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. It'll be pretty much the same format as your last exam. Maybe slightly different, it just depends. But it'll more or less look the same. I'll probably throw in a bonus again. And I'll give you several questions that you get to choose just a few of them to answer. You don't have to answer all of them. So start thinking about that and preparing for that. Also, the other thing is your homework for the last chapter. That is due Thursday. Thursday? Yeah, I think I made it due Thursday. Yeah, April 8th. So your homework is due Thursday. That's the chapter 7 homework. All right. So that's what we have coming up this week to look forward to. Are there any questions? Okay, cool. Now, I guess one issue is that we will have the chapter 8 homework due after the exam. So I'll assign the problems. In fact, I guess we can go ahead. I'll go ahead and assign the problems right now, but they won't be due until after the exam. let's see, where are we here? So for this chapter, chapter 8, even though we're not quite done yet, the homework for chapter 8 will be, let's see here. Let's do number 2, number 4, and number 7. So 2, 4, and 7 for chapter 8. So you can, at least get started on those and take a look at them in preparation for the exam. Okay. All right. Any questions, anybody? All right, great. All right. Well, we'll wrap up chapter 8 on Wednesday and get started with chapter 9. As always, feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, I'll just see you guys on Wednesday.
Professor, quick question.
Yes.
It's about the final. I know it's on the syllabus, it says it's optional, but I was wondering, does that mean that it's replacing your lowest test grade? I just wanted to make sure I understood that right.
Yes, that's right. So that's the policy. So you don't have to take it if you don't want to, but if you do take it, it replaces your lowest exam grade if you do better, right?
That makes sense. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.